welcome officially to the Open Data Policy Lab City Incubator's Data Innovation Bootcamp number 5. So 5 out of 6. We're almost through the entire bootcamp, which is exciting. And today's focus is launch strategies. So something that many of you have been thinking about, probably have familiarity with, and want to cover today, just some fundamentals of what to think through as we're actually getting ready to launch a data innovation. So we're going to be joined by 2 guest speakers later today. Natalia Adler, who's the co-founder and CEO of Pebble Analytics, previous work with Mitiga Solutions and UNICEF, and then also Kisha Bwenge, who's the Senior Community Building Manager at the Open Contracting Partnership and previously at Reboot Consulting, where she's worked with governments and social good organizations around the world. And so, yes, as mentioned, week 5, great job, everyone. 1 more week of boot camps to go. And the focus for today, kind of as it says here, even with a perfect action plan, first impressions make a big difference. So making sure you have your T's crossed, your I's dotted before you're going to launch your data innovation is incredibly important. So today is going to be really focused on, I would say, 2 primary bucket areas. One is the communication side of things. How do you talk about what you're doing? But then also making sure that we're checking on the data innovation itself. How do we make sure that the product, the data innovation itself is ready for showtime, if you will. And so Natalia is going to be speaking a bit to that. And then we've rejiggered a few things to really make sure that we have time for the exercise and the discussion today, as I know we've been running out of time with previous speakers. So I want to make sure that we'll have time to really dig into questions, but we will also continue to have Q&A after each presenter. So if you do have questions, go ahead and continue to make note of those. All right, so I'm going to be the first presenter for today and sharing a bit about messaging development. So this was something that kind of building off of the strategic positioning concept, theories, and tools from last week. Something that is still very relevant as we talk about launch strategy for data innovations. And so, I'm sure many of you have seen this image before. If you haven't, it's actually pretty interesting. There are 2 different images that you can see. So if you focus on the white part of the image, you see a vase. And if you focus on the black part of the image, you actually see 2 different faces halfway turned in. And so the point of this here is kind of depending on where you're coming from, your background, your experience in that moment, you might perceive something differently than someone else. So faces versus vases or vase, and risk versus opportunity. I don't know if folks have seen those HSBC ads, but they actually have a fair amount of these like photos where they position things as, this could either be a terrible scenario or perhaps it's an opportunity for growth. And I think it's an important thing to think about with messaging as well. And I think especially with data innovation, because with data, as we know, not everyone is data literate. Not everyone is going to understand exactly what you're doing or what your team is all about. And they might have preconceived ideas about data, your city government, et cetera. And so making sure that we put different hats on to think through, well, what are the different ways that this message could be interpreted are extremely important. And so what I've put together today is what I'm calling the anatomy of a message. And so really, different buckets and frameworks to think through the different parts of a message that it's important to think through when you're crafting how to communicate about your data innovation. And you'll notice, some of this hopefully looks a little familiar within the audience and ask sections from the stakeholder mapping work that was presented a few weeks ago. So, audience, thinking about who is completely internal, who might be semi-internal, somewhat external. I like to think of elected officials as often being in that place, depending on how your government is set up. Perhaps you think about the legislature as being a bit semi-internal, and then completely external folks. So those might be partners, the broader public, etc. And then the ask. So, what are you asking this set of stakeholders, this audience for? Sign off for resources? Are you getting in touch with them to mitigate risks? Or perhaps there's kind of a broader values-based ask here, as when communicating with the public, which you could position as mitigating risks, but could also be, part of our responsibility as the government is to communicate with this community or with the broader public. And then the two kind of newer categories that show up in this framework here today are format. So when we're thinking about a message, it's really important to not just assume that an email will be fine, or a press release. We always do a press release, but really taking the time to think about what kind of format is going to be most effective for this audience and based on this ask. And then lastly, word choice. So making sure that, we're being very deliberate about the words we're using, the language that we're using in the anatomy of the message. And we'll go into more detail about that in a moment. And so step one, the anatomy of a message, starting with the audience. And so just some questions to think through as you're thinking about your audience is, putting on a bit of an anthropologist or even a psychologist hat on is, does this audience like being in the loop before others? Is it going to be important that this stakeholder I'm communicating to is the first one to know about this? Do they care about the order in which they're consulted? Are they going to find out if someone else found out about this before them? And it can sound kind of petty, to be honest, but these things really do make a difference. And so thinking through, what does this audience care about? What is the sequencing? Which email needs to go before the press release? Who needs to know before this is made public? Might seem trivial, but it can actually be really important in fostering trust and getting buy-in for your data innovation before it launches. And then does this audience need everything to be polished, or can you brainstorm with them? Can you show them a draft version of something? Or does everything need to be perfectly buttoned up for them to really feel like they can trust the work that you're doing? And then let's see, lastly here, is this a new audience or one you have a relationship with? So potentially related to the question above, but also, something important to keep in mind. If it's a first impression, if it's the first time you're engaging with this audience, usually better to defer to being a bit more professional, a bit more buttoned up, before you can kind of figure out kind of how casual you might be able to be with that group. And so once you've kind of put yourself in this audience's shoes, you want to think about, okay, well now what am I asking for? What do I need from this audience? Am I asking them to tweet this announcement for me? Am I asking them to provide sign off? Am I just emailing them to make sure that they're in the loop and helping to mitigate the risk of somebody feeling left out as this launch announcement goes out? And so really thinking through, what is in this for them? Like, what you're trying to get out of it, but again, putting yourself in their shoes and thinking about what might be interesting about my work from their perspective, and making sure that your message communicates from that angle. So, ice cream to me is the ultimate incentive. So that's that's how I think about incentives. If you can buy them ice cream and get them to help. And then going into the format. So this is something that I think often gets kind of set aside or perhaps not thought through as much. I'm actually someone who at the beginning of my career was terrified of picking up the phone. I just wanted to email everyone, even if they just sat right next to me. I was like, talking to people is scary. I'm definitely just going to use email forever. And then my boss actually forced me. He said, no, Adrienne, go walk over to them, go talk to them. That's going to be much more effective than sending this email that you drafted. And it was probably some of the best advice I ever had was, I should really think through when to email, when to walk over to the desk, when to give someone a call, when to travel for 2 hours to their office to go actually meet with them in person, because that's going to make a big difference for them. And I would say, especially thinking about kind of the power dynamics at play. So if you sit within City Hall, if you sit within a mayor's office, it's also going to make an extra big, there's going to be a bigger effect if you show up in person. I remember that the Parks Department had actually invited me to an event, and I thought it was a courtesy and decided I was a little too tired. I decided not to go, and found out afterwards that it was actually a very big deal that this person from the mayor's office they had invited hadn't shown up to this event. And it was a very good reminder to me that, oh, I need to keep in mind, the power dynamics and the perception that comes with, being in an executive office versus being in an agency, et cetera. So, will traveling to their office be seen as a sign of a big effort? Can you simply walk over to the desk, have a more casual conversation? And I think within government also, there's also a question of what would you like written down that could potentially be referenced or forwarded along, or would it be better to have something via phone or like a non-documented conversation? So that's something to keep in mind as well. And then in terms of word choice, so, thinking through internal jargon. So this is something that I think is very common in governments, especially using acronyms, using words, especially in tech teams as well. Words like Scrum, even words like Agile, not necessarily something that everyone understands. And so making sure that you take a step back and you think about, well, what are some of the words here in my message that might be alienating or exclusionary to others? Something that they might have to Google. Can we mitigate for that? Can we try not to use this internal jargon? And then there's organizational jargon. So kind of coming back to acronyms, agency names, assumptions that folks understand how your government works, if it's a public message, industry language, so going back to technical terms. And plain language is something that in the city of New York, we were really incentivized and encouraged to think about how to use plain language in our work in order to just make it as accessible as possible, whether it's for internal or external audiences. And to be honest, that can be a very difficult exercise. I think that when we're trained professionally, we're taught that writing, the more complex your writing is, the better. And the reality is that could be the case, but it depends on your goal. So if you're trying to get people to understand what you're saying quickly, plain language, while it might sound less complex and grandiose, is actually probably going to accomplish the goal of helping more people to understand what you're talking about without having to Google terms or feel like perhaps this is something that's too technical that they're never going to understand anyway. And there are a variety of tools that can help support plain language. And I'm happy to actually share some of those in a follow-up message. And kind of another component, which is in the last question here on step 4, is thinking through the tone also. So the words matter, but also, should it be fun sounding? Should it be very serious sounding? And this might really depend on, it might be out of your hands to decide this kind of thing. It might be in the hands of a communications director. It might be in the hands of, the administration who maybe just joined or maybe is on their way out and they have specific lens through which they like to communicate announcements and messages. And so in the few minutes that I have left here, I just wanted to share a bit of a case study. So Open Data Week is an initiative that I co-founded in New York City government with a local New York City-based civic tech startup back in 2017. We started out with 12 different events. The GovLab was actually one of the founding event organizers back in the day. We had a few hundred participants, and now this is something that continues to happen the first week of March every year. I think they had more than 100 events last year and about, I think, more than a few thousand attendees. So it's kind of turned into this really big festival, working with different community organizers and organizations in order to help spread the message about open data. And so now, what's amazing is that this initiative is normalized. But when I was working to launch it in 2017 and even for its second year in 2018, there was some strategic messaging that had to happen in order to get this initiative off the ground. And so I'll share two examples of where the anatomy of the message can kind of show up for this project. And so, one key part of Open Data Week was recruiting different community organizations across New York City and encouraging them to basically invest in hosting an event for free as a part of, let's say Open Data Week 2018. So if we'd done this once before, would you please do this again? I can't give you any money, but we're going to promote you as much as we can. And so I'd send this via email usually. And the word choice was it was positive, upbeat. In English, we say that it's the coolest thing since sliced bread. And that was definitely my vibe, was just, this, everyone's doing it. This is the coolest thing. You're missing out if you don't, participate. And, the subject line was invitation in order to, really make it sound a bit, you've been hand selected to participate in this. And as you can tell from my pineapple party, there was really just this about, this is so fun, this is going to be great, come and be a part of this initiative that's happening. As opposed to, what might be seen as a more normal government message as, maybe a bit more tight-lipped or very professional sounding, really tried to infuse a sense of the energy that we're looking to cultivate with the initiative. A very different type of tone for the same initiative would go to the executive team. So, there was a small hiccup in 2018 where there were some executives who were worried about one of the events that was as a part of the lineup and had asked me, I think you should take this event down. And this was very problematic, as you might imagine. It was not going to go over well with the event organizer. It wasn't going to work for me as the manager of the initiative. And so my goal, my ask was, please don't shut down this event. And so this was clearly not going to be an email or a phone call. So organize an in-person meeting with the executives that were concerned. And in terms of the messaging, no, nothing was written, everything was oral and very calm, poised, outlining the risks, staying firm at the same time. So you can see that, from party pineapples to a very scared looking cat, for the same initiative, there can be very different audiences, very different asks, and very different tactics from a messaging perspective. So that is all for my presentation. So with that, I'm happy to introduce our next presenter, Natalia Adler. As mentioned earlier, co-founder and CEO of Pebble Analytics. I'm happy to also let her provide a more detailed introduction. And Natalia, I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to have you share your screen or simply speak however you'd like to share with us today. And really, really happy to have you joining us. So thank you for being here.
Well, my pleasure. Hi, everybody. This is so great to be here. Can you see my screen? All right. Yes. Perfect. So I'm going to get started right away, and I'm going to start with a little bit of introduction. I used to work for over 14 years for UNICEF, and part of the work that I did that most recently, actually, when I was back in our headquarters in New York, was to work with GovLab on creating the Data Collaboratives Initiative, which tried to leverage data from the private sector to tackle very complex problems. And we can talk a lot about that. But I've left not long ago to come to Barcelona, that's where I am right now, to co-found this startup that does epidemics forecasting, and we use data science, crowdsourced data, and mobile app. And I also serve as an advisor for another startup, a more mature startup, that is a spin-off of the Barcelona Supercomputing Center, and I act as their advisor on innovation and product discovery. And one of the things that all these companies have in common is that we're all trying to turn data into action. And action can be in the form of a change in policy, a change in behavior, increased sales. So with this experience, and I know it may not be a lot, but I'm just going to share a few takeaway messages from this. And with any kind of a free advice, please take it with a grain of salt. So there are going to be 8 pieces of advice. The first one, and I'm sure you have heard this over and over again. If you haven't, you will start. But it's the importance of knowing your customer. And here, it's one of them. I think the most important thing is to tackle some of the takeaway, some of the assumptions that we have when we think like, oh, we know our customers. And maybe to qualify, maybe some of you are like, oh, but we don't have customers. Okay, you have users, you have clients, whatever it is. I like to still use the word customers because it keeps us on edge, but think of them as your user. And a lot of assumptions I think we have here, regardless if you're in the public sector or in the private sector. Sometimes we think that we know who they are. And at UNICEF, a lot of times they said, oh, you know, government or policymakers or this and that. But the reality is that we need to be much more specific than that. The other assumption that I've seen with that is that, oh, no, I don't need to think about that yet, because if I build it, they will come. Big assumption there. And sometimes we think, well, you know, I'll think about the customer later when I hire a UX designer that will help me with that. And that's always not the case. And I have seen that a lot of times when it comes to these things, we tend to vary a lot on where we are in terms of knowing our customers. I think in the public sector, this is not always on the top of our minds. When I was in UNICEF, it was kind of low because there was this assumption that we knew. And it grows more and more as in the private sector, but it's not always homogeneous here. So there are a few differences here and there. I'm not going to go into details there, but it's just so you know. The second piece of advice, okay, I would love to know my customer, but how can you get to know them if you're still in the process of building your data product, or you have an idea, but it's not fully developed yet? Here, I'm going to share what we had done with Pebble Analytics in terms of trying to really figure that out. So there's quite a lot of research that you can do. So who would be the potential user and the leads for your products? And then what we did next was try to see if we could match those in that research with kind of like existing profile on LinkedIn, you know, and just trying to get information about that. Once you do that, you can create personas. And personas, if you're not familiar with this concept, these are nothing more than the archetypes of those potential leads that you have found before. And you keep doing that, and you can tailor your communication strategies, you can tailor your products and try to see if you have a match. But of course, this is more private sector than you might be thinking, but not quite. Because one of the things that we have done, for example, is that it's definitely not a private sector thing. Back when I was in Nicaragua, for example, we used what is called a human-centered design approach to actually support officials in the government in Nicaragua to think like designers, to actually develop policies. There's a whole link here about this process. You can see more or less here the personas that we have created for the groups that we're trying to target. These would be beneficiaries of services, which is quite important as well. You can do the same thing for the data products that you may have. Now, I'm not going to go in details on how you create these personas. There's quite a lot of guidance out there. This was just a very quick search that I did, and it's not difficult. You're data people, you can do this in your sleep. Now, let's assume that you actually went ahead and built your data product already. Don't worry, I think we're all guilty of that. I have done that also, even that I know that I should start with the customer first. But this idea of being client-centric or user-centric, it really doesn't go away, never, even after you build your product. So what you can do, if you have already built your product, you still needed to know your customers, and you're going to do that through a user experience now, because you already have a product. One way to do that is to really map the user experience. So how the user comes into contact with your product. It might be, let's say, if you have a dashboard, they might need to register or log in. You ask yourself if you want to add, or if you're existing product has some kind of interactivity there, and so forth. And you start mapping that out. You can add much more details as you go along to really try to see if you understand that user journey. If there's anything missing, you tested it with other people. You can even go into more details and look at the service blueprint. So not just from a user perspective, but what happens behind the scenes in terms of, the engagement, the back end, and so forth. Mapping this out really gives you a really good idea of your product and how it's going to be deployed, and make sure that everybody comes on board. Now, let's go back to the point about designer, and you're going to be thinking, well, I would love to have these blueprints done, but I cannot do it. Maybe I should hire a UX designer. And here, just a little pun on the data collaboratives from Stefano and Andrew. You can do the same thing with design. You can engage in collaboration with design schools. So for example, the examples that you saw before, we did that all pro bono in collaboration with the Center for Design at Northeastern University. Back in UNICEF, I used to collaborate also with an ad agency, one of the biggest ad agencies in the world. So there's quite a lot that you can do and to engage in this process if you don't have the capacity or the resources to do it yourself. Now, one of the last ones, I mean, there's 8, but this is probably one of the most difficult ones, is to keep it simple. I think we are falling in love with our products, that we have that tendency that we want to do everything. But as you can imagine, making decisions based on evidence is already hard enough. And you really have to make your products extremely simple and to the point. So don't add everything. I think it's a problem that I see all the time. We want to add as many features as possible. Don't. And here, I would even give another advice. In fact, create a product with a kind of mentality that is very common in the private sector, within layers. So you would have what would be your freemium or basic offering with few features. And then you can have another one that has more features. That's probably your professional, or you have one that has everything. That's your premium. And in this one, if you add these elements of layers and complexity, you can even try to think, can we explore something like a public-private partnership that this can be explored economically? So you have your basic layer or professional layer for free, and then you can have a premium layer that can be explored, not for profit, but maybe to pay, let's say, the expenses of your team or so forth. Maybe it's a little too radical, but I'm just throwing it out there. One of the last ones is delight your customers. So they will come, they will use your products, they might be enjoying it, but there's still a lot more that you have to think about the user journey. This is a blueprint that we had created, for example, for Mitiga, in terms of not only how they experience your product, but things that you can add in that journey to make them happy, to make them delighted, including thinking about troubleshooting, for example, surveys and things like that. None of these are trivial. We know that in our own lives that if things are not working, we probably will abandon that product. And the last comment that I have is show me the money. Probably this is the most difficult one, is when we think about return of investments. We have a tendency to, again, fall in love with the products, especially when we are data-driven and we think that everybody else is and should be. We know that that's not the case. So I think we still needed to do some extra push to convince people of the validity of what we're doing. And I think here, especially in the public sector, we don't always talk about money, but I still think it's an important one. So for example, in the case of Pebble Analytics, we actually created a formula that can demonstrate the impact of what a 2-week forecast for COVID-19, what is the impact in terms of money that it could have. And when you show that to people, this is why you should be using this new product, I think that makes a huge difference, but that's the jury's still out there. Anyway, so this is it from me.
All right, so it's my pleasure to introduce our next guest speaker for today, a collaborator and good friend, Kisha, who's the Senior Community Building Manager at Open Contracting Partnership, and previously at Reboot, the consulting firm based in Brooklyn that works with organizations across the world and in social impact and governments as well. And so Kisha, I'm happy to let you provide a more deep introduction to yourself and your work, in addition to thanking you for sharing your wisdom with this group today. And you're welcome to share your screen or to simply speak for whatever you have prepared today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adrienne, and it is lovely to meet you all. I'll give a quick intro and then I'll start screen sharing for the actual presentation. But as Adrienne mentioned, my name is Kisha Bwenge, and I am currently the Senior Community Building Manager at the Open Contracting Partnership. And we are a collaborative of governments, businesses, nonprofits who sort of work together to make sure that public contracts are open and effective and efficient and equitable and all of the E's. But we're based in DC, but we work globally across like 60 countries. And my work is really helping us bring together the network of folks who care about public sector reform and who see contracting as a lever for creating better public services. But as Adrienne also mentioned, my previous work was at Reboot, and we worked on human-centered design in the public sector and in any sort of social sector reform. I had the pleasure of meeting Adrienne through Reboot when we worked really closely with the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics and help them build their 10-year strategy and help them tell the story of open data in New York over the course of a few years. And I have always been a communications professional, and previously I was working at Lit World, which was a global literacy and social emotional development program that, and we ran communications also for a really global platform of folks who were working in the literacy space. So happy to be here with you, and yeah, let's get started. And do feel free to pop any questions in the chat at any point. I am going to screen share from my second screen here. Am I still?
I can see your screen. I don't know if I can hear you.
Is it better if my sound comes through here? Awesome.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Cool. Okay, well, welcome to Strategic Communications for Data Innovation. Are you all hearing an echo? Awesome. So we're going to talk about how to plan an effective launch, advocate for impact, and tell the story of your open data innovation. So once again, my name is Kisha Bwenge, Senior Community Building Manager at OCP. And today's conversation over the next 10 minutes, we're really going to talk about building a strategic comms plan, why it matters, how to sort of demystify data and reach the people it impacts the most, and how to create a community around your data innovation for the long haul. And we're going to start with the building a strategic communications plan. So, sorry, let me get this here. So the first piece is, why does this matter? I pulled this little quote from an unknown source, apologies, but it says, don't tell me your product is on sale, tell me why it was made. Don't tell me it will fix my problems, but show me the person whose problems it fixed. And, while, the problem challenge versus solution framework is actually very okay and should be used in certain circumstances, I pulled out this quote because I really think at the core of building a strategic communications plan is going back to your mission, going back to your core idea of why you created this product or platform or service in the first place, and whose lives you wanted to affect and change and better through that. And OCP Strategic Communications is really deeply integrated into our mission and organizational strategy, because we know we can't really make an impact or build a community around our open contracting data standard if nobody knows what it is or cares about what we do. And what we constantly try to bring it back to in our communications is open contracting is a lever and a tool to improve public services, to actually save lives, as we've seen during COVID. When a contract goes wrong, people don't get ventilators, people don't get PPE, people don't get vaccines. And at the end of this conversation, we'll talk a bit more about the community building aspect, but I wanted to drive home that kind of starts now. It takes a village to implement and sustain any innovation, and you're building that village when you start to share that innovation with your stakeholders and with new audiences as well. So just bringing it back to the core mission and vision. And we will move on to our strategic comms checklist. So this is a bit more of the nitty gritty of what it actually looks like to build a strategy around your external communications and to really create a platform for sharing your data innovation. We'll start with target audience. I'll just talk through these, but again, feel free to pop some questions in the chat. And overall, from my background at Reboot, a human-centered design firm, a lot of this is really trying to take a user-centered approach. And the link that you all see here is actually something that Open Contracting Partnership and Reboot, both of my organizations, built together. And it is a template that you can feel free to take with you and use and implement in your strategic comms. So, your target audience, a great place to start. A lot of our work really focuses on doing user research before you even get to the stage. So hopefully and probably in the development of your data innovation, you talked to your users and you did some ecosystem mapping and have really identified the stakeholders whose behavior you want to change, whose lives you want to impact, and who you need to sort of convince that this is going to be effective. We sort of recommend starting that with critical near-term efforts, like who do you want to reach in the next 4 to 6 months? It might be a director of, a department that's really going to help you reach citizens through your data innovation, and really just focus on dedicating the resources and your initial outreach to that. Or maybe it is the citizens themselves, like your product is out there and you really want people to know that it exists and how they can use it. So the point of target audience is really to bring you back to the objectives of your launch. Who do you want to reach? Is it everyday citizens to raise awareness? Is it a specific stakeholder group or nonprofit implementation partners? And then also to take that one step further, who are the influencers in this space? Who can help you sort of be the bridge to communicate your message? Who does your existing community and stakeholder groups trust, who you can sort of, use their platforms as well to reach the people that you're hoping to reach? And then we go to problem. So the problem that you are trying to fix and or the current behavior that you would actually like to address or see changed. It is perhaps an elected official does not understand the benefits of this data innovation and you want to reach them and make it a citywide priority. Maybe it is that citizens have no idea that this data innovation exists and that they can use it. So again, bringing this to a really user-centered scope, think about behavior change, and that goes into your goal as well. So you have your target audience, you have the problem. What do you want them to do with this? Like you did within the development of this innovation, through your strategic communications goals, you should really think about what is the positive change that I want to see at the end of this, launch campaign. Mayor makes a public commitment, or citizen group or nonprofit or grassroots organization starts, opening the website for my data innovation. These goals should be really clear and actionable and really bring you closer to your broader project goals. So once again, really seeing that the goals of the innovation itself should be really aligned with the goals of your strategic communications and outreach. Since we are taking a very user-centered approach, we also really like to think, what are the current behaviors and motivations of your target audience, and what are the barriers to making these changes? What do people already care about? Where are they already having these conversations? And how can you take that opportunity to align the message that you have with those priorities, identify those potential barriers, and once again, make the case and develop your key messages around solving those problems and building professional relationships that will influence or reach your target audience. And then we have key messages. I know that Adrienne talked about this at the top, so I won't spend too much time here. But of course, key messages are really tailored to each stakeholder or audience. You will likely have multiple. And so based on the barriers and opportunities for each of them, you can really craft the key messages that will respond to those. Think about this person's position. You can create user profiles and user journeys. And I can share some more resources around that as well. And see who are you trying to reach? What are they doing? Where do your interests overlap? And where does your data innovation help them, solve a problem? And we really recommend sort of like one overarching key messages and then supporting points that will reinforce your argument, usually about 3. So like I said at the top, the challenge statement versus solution is great. But with a user-centered approach, you can really make sure that you're also using natural language to communicate this and integrating sort of storytelling and human impact as you talk about what the problems are and who your data innovation is solving problems for. And a really important part of key messages as well is what's your call to action, particularly in a strategic communications campaign. You know, there's going to be a lot of information about your data innovation, but what do you want people to do? Do you want them to read a report? Do you want them to come to your website? When they come across this information, do you want them to sign up or register for the platform? And really just build your key messages in your campaign around that really clear, concise call to action, and repeat it. Don't be afraid to repeat it a lot. People will need to see something, I think the term is like 7 times before they sort of take an action. So really building in that repetition is important as well. Supporting data is a pretty straightforward one as well. Really focus on collecting external evidence. Once again, going back to that quote, show me who this solved a problem for. What do they say about it? What is their story? And you can tell it in their voice as well. And what pieces of information, whether it's case studies or other resources or evidence or research, will really support the fact that this data innovation is out here, it is launched, it is going to be useful and effective. So much of communications is really driving home that point by bringing in those other voices and external validators. And finally, channels. Consider how you're going to disseminate your message. And, you know, we'll talk a little bit about social media and traditional media as well. But I wanted to say a direct email is just as effective sometimes. A lot of our communications, particularly around big annual campaigns, actually go through a mail merge. So it's just a regular email sent from your regular Gmail account, but a mail merge allows you to do it in mass. And to still have everything addressed like directly to that person. And sometimes that direct outreach is really what's going to be important for relationship building and for, you know, reaching it depends on your stakeholders, but for reaching your target audiences. And going back to the user-centered approach and some of what I already mentioned, think about what channels your target audience is using the most. How can you meet them where they are? One example of the work that we did with Reboot and New York City, but not with the mayor's office. We were working with Bwenge on a hotline for folks to be able to access legal aid and to understand the process to clear their low-level warrants. And we did old school flyering campaign in the community where we were running this pilot, and we stuck posters in local businesses and community centers. We got local news coverage because we really focused on our target audience, and we really met people where they were, because our audience wasn't necessarily on Twitter and they weren't necessarily on LinkedIn looking for this information. They were going to the grocery store and the bus stop and the YMCA and finding out this information about a public service and resource. So really hoping that, you know, this inspires folks to like get creative and not be afraid of what is seen as like old school and traditional channels of reaching your audiences. I will pause there for a minute to come back. I can't see the chat right now, so. Oh yeah, Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, thank you. Cool. So I will keep us moving to, you've already done this, surprise. One message I really wanted to drive home today is that you already know how to communicate this, whether it was, you know, through your application process and through getting that internal buy-in from leadership to get your data innovation to where it is now. And so wanted to encourage you all to say you're already halfway there, and now it's just a matter of turning that advocacy inside out. You've already thought about you know, building relationships and creating key messages and understanding what the barriers are to your key audiences and why, you know, they would care about this innovation. So it's really just a matter of doing that, taking those key messages and turning them outwards into external audiences and targeting it for different stakeholder groups. So you're already halfway there. And another piece is that you are in this program, and that is something that you can really leverage in your strategic communications. We'll call it a humble brag, but you earned your way into an inaugural cohort of this incredible global program, and you should talk about it. You can blog about it. You can use your personal accounts to share how you feel about being in the program, you know, take a gratitude attitude, and really don't be afraid to share that this is an amazing accomplishment for yourself and for your teams. And you can brag about each other as well, you know, share about what your other peers in your cohort are doing, share upcoming, you know, events and programs and launches that each other is doing, and really just, you know, create that supportive community within yourselves. So really encouraging you to also integrate all of that into your strategic communications and leverage it, because it's important. It builds credibility. It is hard work that you have already done, and that you can really use to take your strategic comms to the next level. So these are very quick tips on social media versus traditional media. On the social media side, I already mentioned this a little bit, but don't be afraid to get creative. There, as you know, a lot of comm strategists know, video and visuals are king on social media platforms, and it can be very intimidating to be like, I don't know how to use like Photoshop to like create an infographic, but there are tons of tools, and I'll share a list of resources later with Adrienne. I used Canva to make this very presentation we are looking at. Takes like 30 minutes. There are a lot of templates that you can use and adapt. You can have templates for infographics. You can have templates to make animated GIFs, and just really find fun and creative ways to you know, put things on Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter, because that visual information is really what's going to catch people's eye and get them to take that next call to action that you're hoping for. And when it comes to traditional media, my number one tip is, I think, a lot of the dynamic that we can see often around like government versus media and like bad press is this us versus them mentality. But something that Open Contracting Partnership has really tried to embrace is seeing journalists and media as actually a key stakeholder group in and of itself, and as a really key community group to help us implement our reforms. And so we build relationships with our press partners. We really follow people who are using the open contracting data that our partners are publishing, and telling stories around that, and saying, hey, we can actually create resources and facilitate peer learning with other journalists who are doing this work and who are, you know, on this beat. And so that has been really effective for us to bring them into the fold. So some quick tips there. So demystifying data and telling a story. I am going to share an example from New York City Open Data. As I mentioned, while I was at Reboot, we worked really closely with Adrienne and her team at the time to think about our audience being general residents of New York City, and how we can communicate that open data is something that they can use. It isn't just this like technical, you know, like far off thing. It is actually how the city runs. And we really had so much fun creating a little video, which I will make you all watch because I love this. This is probably the most fun thing I've ever done at my job. And yeah, let's take a look.
How do you keep a city of 8 million people effective, efficient, and on its feet? Open data is part of the approach. Every time you call 311, apply for a construction permit, or ride in a yellow cab, you're contributing to the creation of public data. You're also seeing your government at work. Data sets collected by city agencies keep your government moving at the pace of the people it serves. NYC Open Data is the city initiative to put this data back in your hands. Every day, New Yorkers use open data to advocate for their communities, build their businesses, and hold their elected officials accountable. The city is yours to analyze. Start exploring at nyc.gov/data.
Woohoo. Hope that was fun.
Discover matches all the cash back you earn on your credit card at the end of your first year. It's amazing because Discover's accepted at
We're back. So we understand that, part of the work of data innovation is trying to translate it into layman's terms, especially when your data innovation is really being launched directly to residents and citizens and sort of everyday folks who might not be working with it every day. So a really quick few tips here for how to demystify data and help build data literacy. Use natural language and readability tools. I can also share some links about that to help you make sure that you're communicating it at a expanded reading level. Make sure that you're bringing on folks or consultants who aren't necessarily, neck deep in your world. Communicate it to them, see if they understand, ask for feedback, or, one thing that Moda did was sort of bring Reboot on as a consultant. We are public sector reform experts, but don't work with Nyc Open Data every day. And we're able to sort of think of ways to translate that into what we, as also everyday New Yorkers, would hopefully understand. And then, also use events and tools to build literacy for folks who do want to learn more. Something we did at Open Contracting Partnership was this procurement escape room activity. We had a webinar that was focused on vendor and supplier diversity, which is a really big part of our mission around open contracting, making sure that small, minority-owned, women-owned businesses have more access to government contracts. And we made everybody go to a city website and see how many clicks it took for them to find an RFP or a request for proposals, and just putting them in the shoes of a small business and to say, this information is really hard to find in a lot of cases. There were some examples where it took over 30 clicks to even get somewhere. So a simple activity like that can really help folks be like, okay, this is the data, this is the information, this is where I find it. Actually, it's really challenging. And for a lot of government folks, they were like, this was eye-opening for us. So, just a fun example of how to sort of build that in as well. And the last point I will make is around creating community to amplify your impact. Your launch is really important. Everything we talked about, from target audiences and platforms and influencers and building out supporting data and case studies is really critical, especially, I know that the description said you only have one chance to make a great first impression. So whether it's, a 3-week launch campaign or a one-time launch event, it's really important to do this work. But now, as a community building manager, I've also been thinking about, how do you extend that into the long haul? How do you keep that engagement going long past the launch event or the Zoom webinar? And this is sort of the ladder of engagement that we use internally at Open Contracting Partnership to think about community. And I tried to sort of adapt that to this. So we have Connect. That's just a matter of being responsive to your users and to your audiences and making sure that when they have questions, you're there to answer them. Start building relationships with your users and with your peers and other folks who are doing this sort of data innovation around the world, as you are already. Convene is really about thinking about bringing folks together. So less about sort of one-to-one connection and more of how do we start making those individual relationships into group relationships? And that might mean joining other communities and saying, oh my God, Code for America has an incredible community and they have an annual conference. Maybe I can go be on a panel or present something or put a panel together about some of the work that we all really care about. And this might also mean within your own city, building an advisory board of a multi-stakeholder group of people who can, be a continuous feedback loop for this product as it, continues to live on in perpetuity. Collaborate is me getting into my little Reboot hat. We really focused on co-design and co-creation, and a lot of the work we did with Moda was around, again, that multi-stakeholder collaboration. It's a really powerful tool for community building, even though it has become a really big buzzword. But we hope that in the development of your data innovation, you did already bring in multiple voices and talk to your users, and it's just a matter of carrying that spirit into the actual implementation of the product, platform, service. And then celebrate. This is something that OCP also really loves to do, recognizing your own achievements and of your team and of every stakeholder and an individual who contributed to that. This can be a really quick social media shout out or tag, or something that OCP is doing is an entire campaign showcasing the people behind the stories, the people behind the reforms. And that's also just a really fun way to move forward and keep that communication going through your social media, through your individual relationships that you've built. So that's me. Thank you all. I will log out of this.
Thank you so much, Kisha. It's always a pleasure to, hear your experience, your wisdom, and just the frameworks. And it sounds like the escape room was particularly popular. Cindy mentioned in the chat that she really loved the name. It's a great example of, finding a new way to talk about a problem in an engaging way with folks.